We all have a story that if we start to tell it, we know we need a lot of time because we need to go and give all the requisite background information. We need to set up the context. We need to have time for the various tangents that illuminate the emotional backdrop and the characters in the story. I know I have a story from my trip to the US back in 2009, which ends with me getting questioned by the police, that people close to me know they can go and probably cook a half-decent pasta dinner in the time it will take me to tell the story. Some stories need a big scope. My guest today, in her work on Paul's letter to the Romans, employs the analogy with Terrence Malick's masterpiece, The Tree of Life, which in order to tell the story of a small Midwestern family in the 1950s and their grief and their pain, has to go back to the very beginning, the creation of the cosmos, the first act of tenderness between two dinosaurs. All this is required in order to tell this story that seems quite minute. But that's important, says my guest, for understanding what Paul is on about. As she writes in the book, a prolonged and careful study of Romans means finding that salvation is more complex, more cosmic, more challenging than we have usually imagined. And if you haven't already guessed it, my guest today is Beverly Roberts Gaventa, and we are talking about her book, When in Romans, an invitation to linger with the gospel according to Paul. An incredible, insightful, accessible short book on this very big text. Beverly Roberts Gaventa is a distinguished professor of New Testament at Baylor University and Emerita professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. And she is the author and editor of dozens of books, including Our Mother, St. Paul, or Apocalyptic Paul, Mary, and you should definitely check out her work. But before you do that, keep listening and please make welcome our most wonderful guest, Beverly Roberts Gaventa. And once again, I forget to introduce my name or the podcast, so here it is at the end. I'm Liam Miller. Welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat. I am here with Beverly Roberts Gaventa, and we're going to be talking today about When in Romans. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to get to talk with you. So I guess before we get maybe specifically into the book, I guess, you've written a number of books on Paul or edited books on Paul and the New Testament and Mary and a whole bunch of topics. But I want to stay with Paul because I guess the question being maybe why Paul? Because, depending on the circles you run in, that's not an uncontroversial person to look at.
Right. Well, my interest in Paul goes back to my own education in an MDiv program, almost half a century ago. And I probably had the same attitude that Paul was not somebody I wanted to have anything to do with. But I took a course from J. Lewis Martin on Paul's letter to the Romans, and I came out of that with just a whole lot of questions about Paul and interest in Paul and the way the letters argue and where he's getting ideas and also just a very existential sense of being drawn to his understanding of the gospel. So all of those things have mixed together over the years to keep me interested in Paul.
That's good. That's cool. So again, in your work on Paul, you've edited a volume called Apocalyptic.
Right.
Paul, you've got Our Mother, St. Paul, which has a lot of these apocalyptic themes come through again. And now I reckon for a lot of people who are listening to this, when they hear that word, they're still thinking about the concept of maybe post-apocalyptic in sense of the setting of many films and books.
Right.
But maybe it might be helpful just to kind of set the ground here. What is this referring to, I guess, in your work or in Pauline studies?
Sure. Well, it is confusing because we tend to use the word now as an equivalent of disaster, In theological terms, in biblical terms, apocalypse, as I'm sure you know and a lot of listeners will know, apocalypse, it means revelation, right? I mean, that's where we get the Greek word. It means to uncover. And so in biblical studies, we use it in two ways that are, I think, related. One is for a set of texts that center around an apocalypse, a specific revelation to a seer, sometimes about what events are going to happen in the future, or ostensibly events that are going to happen in the future. And we also use it, in that sense, it's fairly limited to things like 4th Ezra and the book of what we call in the New Testament the book of Revelation, which is also the apocalypse. There are elements in Paul's letters that are narrowly understood apocalyptic, as in, for example, Romans 11, where he says, I'm going to tell you a mystery. Well, that's an apocalyptic expression. I have this knowledge that I have received and I'm going to pass it on. But apocalyptic is also used in another more, broader sense for Paul's way of thinking about what God has done in Christ. And there it means, roughly speaking, at the most general level, that the apocalypse of Jesus Christ is God's intervention in the world as it is. That you can't simply read the Old Testament or read Jewish literature and predict what's going to happen in Jesus, that you can't reason forward, that this is a real intrusion in the way the world is. Sometimes people use the word invasion, which makes other people nervous, but it is a kind of invasive act by a powerful God to rescue humanity.
Thank you for that. I think that's really helpful to have that kind of out there as we begin to talk about the book in earnest. And so with when in Romans, you've not gone kind of, it's not a verse by verse commentary. It's not working through even kind of linearly through the book. You've chosen kind of main themes to explore, salvation, Israel, ethics and worship, and community. I guess what led you to take this approach, and were they the four that it was like, yep, from the beginning, these are the four I'm going to cover, or was there a wrestling of exactly what key concepts and themes you were going to highlight?
To be honest, I'm not sure I remember. The book grows out of lectures I've given in a variety of venues, some churches, some seminary groups, some college settings. And it focused on some ways in which I think Paul can be misunderstood. And in part, I was trying to get out of this notion that, I was trying to get away from this notion that Romans is simply about doctrine. That is to say that it's narrowly instructional about Christian doctrine. But I was also trying to loosen up, to broaden some of the ways in which people think about the letter. For example, to go back to not being doctrinal, for example, one of the chapters, as you know, is about worship. People don't often associate Romans or Paul in general with worship, but I find that there's a lot of worship language in the letter, and I think it's just important to recover some of those elements that tend to be ignored when we focus on the same issues over and over again. In some ways, I was trying to broaden, the word I keep using is horizon, the way people think about the letter. They either tend to think of it, and we all do this, in terms of an individual relationship with God, or sometimes in terms of God's relationship to Israel, or Israel and the Gentiles. And my approach is to affirm all of those. I don't think those should be negated, but to place the letter in a much larger, the word I keep using is cosmic or universalizing context, that it has to do with all humanity and really the whole of creation.
Well, yes, I mean, that comes through in your first kind of chapter when you're engaging Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life.
Right.
Now, the more maybe people have seen that film, the more explicit scriptural connection might be to make with the book of Job.
Yes.
So I guess, how did you come to make the connection with it to Paul's writing on salvation? And I guess, how does it illuminate, as you say, that large cosmic context, the broad scope in which Paul's language of salvation occurs?
Well, I think the honest thing to say about that is that I've been working on Romans so long that everything is about Romans. So that might, it may be that that's the right way to go with this. And I wouldn't deny that there's a connection to Job. I rather doubt that Terrence Malick or whoever wrote that script was thinking about Romans, but he could have been. Because to me, the thing about that story is that it's such a tiny little story, right? I mean, it's a small story about one family and its way of making it, how they make their way through the world, through terrible tragedy and loss and so forth. And yet, as Malick tells it, if you know the film, he's constantly taking us out of that tiny story and showing us the whole of creation. It flashes to some scenes that are very confusing when you first see it, in which the whole of the created order is reflected. And I think that it's not too much of a stretch to say that's also what Paul does, that we have this small question about our relationship to God, and that's not a question that Paul rejects, but he's constantly placing, well, not just our relationship to God, but what happened to Jesus. He places this account of God's doings in Jesus Christ in a context that includes not just Israel and Gentiles, but the whole of creation. So it's that I find as a way of helping us break out of a narrow reading of the letter.
Yeah, I thought that was really good because, Malick is determined to show that the only way you'll understand what happens to this family is, if we think about the first act of mercy the world ever saw between two dinosaurs on a riverbank,
Right.
Only when it's put in this place of there is a huge story and that looks forward too. And
as well. Yes, that final scene on the beach or the setting where families are together and not, and I thought it was gorgeous.
Yeah. I loved a quote from the book, which is a prolonged and careful study of Romans means finding that salvation is more complex, more cosmic, and more challenging than we have usually imagined. And we've just been getting into this and this scope that we have discussed. But it also, this quote points to the rectification of the cosmos, that it's not just about humans and God, but about all of creation. And it also then, as you kind of develop later in the book, challenges us to take seriously the word all.
Right.
Now, if you were talking, as you have when you were developing this book, talking with ministers or people training to be ministers or people charged with Christian education in various settings, I guess, how would you begin to encourage them to explore with their community the more of Paul's picture of salvation? Because again, it's going to be different to maybe what people have traditionally opened the book of Romans for. It's a thing that you might have to go gently with. Do you have kind of advice or thoughts on how you begin to speak of this picture?
Well, as a biblical scholar, probably what I would do is say, look, let's read these texts together. And you read that first chapter and you get this repeated all language. And then you talk about Romans 5, which presses beyond simply our being in Abraham. We're also in Adam and in Christ. And once you say Adam, that means the whole of the human race. There is no one who was not born, as Paul sees it, in Adam, that is to say, in the created human. And then I would look at chapter 11, his treatment of Israel, where again you get this language of all of Israel, 11:26. And I think it is challenging to what most people have traditionally thought about Paul or about the New Testament. And one of the things I would say is this is not the whole of Scripture. There are different threads in Scripture, and they don't all say the same thing. And sometimes they may not even be in agreement with one another. And I have to concede there are places in Paul that have judgment language, accountability language. And so one is always weighing which one of these explains the other one. They're not uniform. So which one is the one through which we read the letters? And I think finally we have to say, as Paul does at the end of Romans 11, that this question of the universal extent of salvation is not ours to resolve, right? It's remarkable to me how often people worry about this question of the scope of salvation when Paul's letters, and actually the New Testament as a whole, doesn't worry about that question very much. It has to do more with offering good news and how we live in light of that good news and how we share that good news because it's true, not by way of scaring people out of their wits, which is the kind of Christianity a lot of us grew up with. And so I would go into it with the texts themselves. I'm sorry, I hit my keyboard.
Oh, that's okay.
I would go into it with the texts themselves and, and suggest that maybe Paul's way of thinking is somewhat challenging to ours. And then we have to ask why that is. One of the things that's problematic for us is that we want to be sure everybody thinks and behaves the way we think they should. And we tend to underestimate the radical grace that we need as much as anyone else. There's a kind of desire on our part to want to weigh people or to want God to weigh people. This person is better than that person. But in Paul, at least in Romans, there's a lot of leveling of the playing ground. There's not this sense that, well, you're almost okay, and this person is really, really bad. Those are gradations that don't turn up. And it's pretty distressing to us.
Indeed. Yeah. That really, just serves a lot of neat categorization that we like to do. Yes. And I thought you touched on it there in that response too. What's so, you work it out in the book as well. Like, there's often that question of, well, if we take that all seriously, why do we do any of this? And as I say, well, Paul, it was good news, and Paul thought it changed lives, and it changed his.
It changed his. It changed, it opened up a world. It's a new world in Christ. So I always find that question very interesting.
Yes. So moving to the next chapter, which is your chapter on Israel, consider Abraham. You write that for Paul in Romans, Israel belongs to God as God's creation. It is always and only God's creation, and Israel will remain God's creation, even in the eschaton. Now, obviously, this is an important topic to tackle, not only because it's in Romans, but given the history of Christian-Jewish relations, and also the present relationship, where we see, I was reading an article the other day which was talking about the booming rise of the tourism industry taking US evangelical Christians to Israel, amidst some rather concerning political religious rhetoric. So I guess, what was it like to approach this chapter kind of in the current climate, or what is it like to live in the current climate, given you're someone who is always thinking about Romans? And I guess, how might you hope this too maybe reshapes some conversations happening in churches all over the place?
Well, to begin with, I would want to make clear that when we talk about Romans 9 through 11 or Romans 4, places where Paul is talking about Israel, he is not talking about a state of Israel. And he is, to be very fair and explicit about it, he's talking about a situation in his own time. So as Christians read it and use it, and I think we have to be very careful what we extrapolate. Paul's comments, for example, when he is critical of Israel, those are not comments that can be projected onto the future. In fact, I think they're comments that are very much limited to his own time, his own confusion and deep concern about the fact that most of Israel, he keeps saying Israel, what he means is most of Israel does not recognize Jesus as the Messiah of God. Having said that, this notion that I keep pressing, that Israel belongs to God as God's creation, means that, and by that I mean what other people would call ethnic Israel. But I think when Paul talks about it, he's talking about God's action, God's people that God has created. And there's a sense in which one thread in 9 through 11 is God created this people and God will see to it. God made promises to this people, and those promises are not promises that are going to expire. Those are promises that have no expiration date. And also that those promises will come to fulfillment in God's good time, on God's way of thinking about it. And so, one of the things that he is adamant about there is a kind of Gentile arrogance. There's a kind of Christian arrogance that assumes we know what God is doing. And I think had that thread in Romans 9 through 11 been taken more seriously for the last couple of millennia, the church wouldn't have gotten itself into the kind of difficulty that it has with thinking about Jews and Judaism.
Oh, thank you for that. And it is, a very important chapter and really well worked through. Now, as I keep reading the book, I come to a rather alarming notion that Paul didn't have an ethic. Paul didn't have an ethic. And so if that's the case, then what does Paul have? Not for an ethic.
That's a very good question. I probably did say that, didn't I? Paul doesn't have an ethic. By which I don't mean Paul is not ethical or that Paul doesn't have ethical instructions. But as you can tell, I'm not happy with some of the tidy categories that we use. So, Romans 1 through 11 is all about theology, or Romans 1 through 8 is about theology. Romans 9 through 11 is about Israel, and Romans 12 through 16 or 12 through 15, the beginning of 15, are about ethics. Well, those are nice handles, but they don't work very well because they presuppose, I think, a kind of division between theology and life. We have these convictions here, and then we figure out what to do based on those. And I think for Paul, it's all much more blended than that. It's much more integrated than that, so that you have everything he says presupposes, everything he says about what we call theology presupposes an ethical outcome, and everything he says about ethics is deeply theological. If I were to say, where is Paul's ethic? Where is the closest we get in Romans to Paul's ethic? Then it would, of course, be Romans 12, 1 and 2. That we are to offer up our persons, he says our bodies, as sacrifice. That is to say, the whole person. Everything that we are and have is God's, period, full stop. And if that is the case, then, this is again a little scary, because when people want to have an ethic, they want to have sort of I'm being facetious because this is probably this is a great exaggeration, but a lot of us want to have a kind of list of things we must do and things we shouldn't do. And Paul's ethic would be more like the deeply offensive claim that we don't belong to ourselves. That's scary to people. So it's scary to me.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yes. As you say, I think one of the subtitles is, throw your body in the offering plate.
Right.
Right. It's a huge demand that is placed on us, not just simply, right, navigating a list that we can tick.
Right. And it's not, being a Christian is not about being in worship on Sunday and 3 things you might do otherwise, but the whole of life. And that's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's not unlike Jesus's response to the question, should I pay tribute to Caesar or not? And his response is, give Caesar what is his and give God what belongs to God. Well, the trick to that is what belongs to God, right? Everything, right? So there's a similar logic going on here.
And that we've written about the ethic, it has a nice kind of build to the goal is to forge worship and ethics into one. Amen. And I think that was a really
I like that line. Yeah. Oh, good.
So then you come to your chapter, Welcome One Another, in which you do some important work on who Paul means as those called to belong to Jesus Christ. Again, this is about maybe disrupting some of the categories that we like to keep so neat, in that who we mean by Christians, or the Christians, right, is not always as simple or as easily defined as we might have expected. Do you just want to give us a little bit of an insight into your thinking here?
Right. Well, again, it's consistent, I think, with what I've been saying all along when he talks in chapter 14 about what appears to be a conflict over how we're supposed to eat, which is, at least in the first century, for anybody who was raised as a Jew, this is a crucial issue. This is not a small matter. And people, there seem to be disagreements about whether food laws that obtained under Israel, in whether Jewish food laws still hold or not, with some people apparently saying yes they do, and others arguing that they don't, and the two quarreling, maybe not quarreling in the abstract over practice, but what happens when you come together at table, what food goes on the table. If there are people in the community who are deeply committed to the continuity of food laws, and we have a potluck supper, and I show up with shellfish, or pork, I am really offending my neighbor. So there's apparently judgment going on in that. And what Paul says is, first of all, you have no business judging one another. That's God's problem, not yours. And the other is welcome the other. Welcome this person who is not like you, who does not think like you, who does not practice like you. And his argument is, Christ welcomed you. You also were other. And you were welcomed. And therefore you have no prerogative about turning somebody away.
I think it's interesting also in the sense of, a lot of the debates currently on like religious freedoms or on like, what often gets termed as, political correctness, in that there's this, it's like, well, I'm not offended by something, so therefore why should I?
Right.
Or I don't need a prayer room in my office, so therefore why should
someone else?
Yeah,
right.
But Paul's kind of like, well, no, be by welcoming others means you have to be attentive to what it is that is offensive to others, or is necessary to others, even if it might not be for you.
Problematic for you, yeah.
So kind of almost like in some ways going to the end and to the beginning. So the book begins with the greetings in Romans 16 and looks specifically within that at the figure of Phoebe. So I want to ask you a question, borrowing a chapter title from another of your works. With the figure of Phoebe being so important, are you saying that Pauline theology is not just a guy thing?
Yes, indeed, I would say that. One of the things I argue there, and I'd probably go a step or two further than some people would, but Paul greets Phoebe, Paul asks that they receive Phoebe, and he comments on the fact that she is a deacon, that she has been a patron of many, including himself. So it seems quite clear, and I think most scholars would agree with this, that Phoebe is the one who is charged with taking the letter to Rome. And my argument after that is that he would not have sent someone with the letter if he hadn't discussed the letter with her. Given what we know about the way writing and what we would call publication happened, it's very likely that she and others sat with him, listened to parts of this letter as he was thinking it through, drafting it, and then that he talked to her about what he wanted to convey, so that when she takes the letter, she is prepared to talk about it. Now, I think, and again, a number of New Testament scholars would agree, that she is the one who reads the letter in these small gatherings of Christians in Rome. Some people would argue against that, but I think by and large, that's a fairly safe assumption. No one else is named. She's the one who has the leadership in another congregation. She seems the logical person. And if so, then she is necessarily interpreting the letter. Because when you read something aloud, whether you mean to or not, you do interpret it. And she's the one who's presumably prepared to talk about it. This means that she has from the beginning a vested interest in this letter. We can see in the rest of the greetings at Rome, in Romans 16, that there were a number of women who are greeted and who are presumably in some kind of leadership roles. That's a different question, but I can come back to that if you want to. And I think it makes eminently good sense to say then that Pauline theology, that Paul is not just thinking about men when he thinks about the gospel and its implications. And even if he were, it's not being heard by just men. And it's being interpreted by women from the beginning. To me, that's a very energizing set of reflections.
Yeah. What I want to see now is a bunch of paintings of Paul writing that aren't him just like doing this on his own, but, a bunch of people in the room, like a TV writer's room, sitting around a table, figuring out.
What a great idea.
Yeah. But no, I think that's a really important thing. And I like what you said there about there's no way to read something that doesn't emphasize one thing or connect things in a particular way. So that's
right. Well, I don't know what the equivalent would be in Australia, but here, the illustration that I sometimes use has to do with news networks. The very same headline can be read in two very different, even conflicting ways, depending on the attitude of the reader.
Yeah, totally. And you imagine that if you hear that letter through in its entirety, by the time you get to the end, you're going to have some questions, or you're going to need, wait, can we go back to that part, and can you clarify that? Or and the person reading would have to play a role, a significant role in that, in shaping that. So, now,
could I add one thing to that? Yeah. Especially when we bear in mind, and people tend to forget, that Paul has never been to Rome. They have never seen him. They may have heard things about him, not necessarily good things, but they don't know him. So he has no voice in their heads. They have no experience with him. So the person who will represent this letter to them in person is Phoebe.
And becomes then very, Paul would have been, you think very deliberate about who he would have chosen, given that he was obviously very careful in this letter, very determined that he comes across, and his theology comes across well.
Right, exactly.
That's really cool. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Now, earlier this year, you spoke at the Karl Barth conference at Princeton. And I know from that video, it's mentioned that you've co-taught classes on Barth and his work on Romans. I guess what is it like writing about Romans almost 100 years after the Romerbrief?
Well, I don't fancy myself in competition with Karl Barth by any stretch of the imagination, and there are ways in which that commentary does have major problems. However, I would bet that it will be read in another 100 years, and probably not many of the things that we're writing now, myself included, will be read then. And part of it is that Barth is so determined to listen to, the Zaka, the content, the real content of the letter. Now, as he does that, I think he has engaged with a lot of traditional exegetical questions, but he does not put those on the surface. So it can be a very confusing commentary to read. But speaking for myself, in many cases, when I have gone back and read what he wrote about a certain passage, and then worked at the text for a while, and then gone back to Barth, I'll see. Oh, I see how you got. I see how you got to this. And yes, actually, I think you're right. He may not have said everything, and there are ways in which he makes huge mistakes. But I think that he has taken the kind of risk that few of us are willing to take.
Well, thank you for that. That's nice. So, speaking of commentaries, like larger commentaries, it's well known you're working on a Romans commentary. How did pulling this book together when in Romans? How did that have impact, influence, problematize anything you were kind of thinking about as you've been working on this larger commentary?
No, I think actually that little book is a help. I mean, it's certainly not, as you know, it's not a commentary. It reflects where my thinking is, and the responses I've had to it have encouraged me as I continue to work on the commentary. And also some of the responses have helped me to know where I need to make sure that I'm making my argument clear, and where I may need to modify it in some respects.
That's great. Well, I put out a call on Twitter yesterday that I was going to be interviewing you, and if anyone had questions, they could let me know. And my New Testament, from my MD, my New Testament lecturer just simply said that he's just not going to teach Romans until he can assign your commentary. So he's waiting with bated breath. So hopefully that serves as an encouragement and not not foreboding.
Yes, those things can be heard in either, one of two ways. So
as we close out, I have a kind of game that I play here, which is pairings. So we need to, like you would in a restaurant, we need to pair your book with a few things. So we need to pair your book with a meal, something to eat alongside when in Romans. A song or a piece of music, and then another book. So if you've read When in Romans and you closed it and you're like, what next? There. So a meal, a piece of music, another book, and we'll pair it away.
So a meal first?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, since we're in Rome, we would have to have pasta. With some excellent red wine.
Okay.
I'll start with that.
That's good. We're off to a good start.
And then a piece of music, right? Well, you know what I'm going to say because you've read the book. I'm going to say Bruce Springsteen and This Train, you know, where he explodes that sense that the train is only for the good. The train is for everybody. And then another book, well, I want to mention all of my friends' books, you know. But maybe, yeah, that there be danger. Rather than specifically a book on Paul, I'm going to mention Phil Ziegler's book, Militant Grace, because there's so many excellent books on Paul, and whichever, you know, if I mention one, I'm in trouble with someone else. But Phil Ziegler is working on a number of these, is working on apocalyptic, and specifically Pauline apocalyptic from a theological perspective. He is himself a systematician. And I find his work immensely helpful for putting me in touch with strands in especially Protestant, but not only Protestant thought that illumine things I'm trying to say in the text.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. People got some good recommendations there. Beverly Gaventa, thank you so much for joining us today. The book is
You're most welcome.
The book is When in Romans, an invitation to linger with the gospel according to Paul. I encourage everyone to check it out, and it's a really accessible and exciting read. It's good for any level of Christian audience, and you could use it in Bible studies or book clubs or things like that. So go ahead and pick it up and leave reviews. Is there anything else you want to plug? Any way people can connect with you, or anything you want to make mention of at this point?
I think that's all, Liam. Thank you very much. It's a good conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Really.